So, I'm Dougald, and I'm going to try to share some ideas with you in the next few minutes under the sort of conveniently contrived title of Third Places, Web 2, First Life. And really, what I want to talk about is the places in which we spend our lives, the places in which we spend our time, and the ways in which we spend our lives, and the ways in which we meet each other. And I want to bring together some ideas from different places about how we organise those places and how we organise those encounters. Some old things, some things that come from the deep history of how people get together and enjoy themselves. Some things that come from sort of academic places in sociology and ideas and books about society. Some things that come from recent years of technology, of the sort of arrival of all of these tools and networks that allow us to connect and organise really cheaply and easily, but which also sometimes feel like they're kind of taking over our lives so that we're plugged into this matrix that will doubtless be bleeping away from time to time in people's pockets as we sit here. The third place is an idea which comes from a sociologist called Ray Oldenburg, from a book called The Great Good Place. And I haven't read it, but I have read the Wikipedia article. But you don't always have to read a book from cover to cover to absorb the big, valuable idea that somebody has come up with. And the idea of the third place is something which has travelled a long way and resonated with a lot of people, and which resonates in a lot of ways with me. It's called the third place because Oldenburg was talking about the spaces in which we spend our lives. And he was talking about how you have home, that's one place, and then you have work, the office, the factory, the workplace, so that's number two. And then we have these other places, which he called third places, and he talked about how this could be a coffee shop or a pub or a hairdresser's where people hang out and have conversations, or a community hall. They're those spaces which, in terms of the amount of our lives we spend in them, for most people in modern societies, we don't spend as much of our lives in the third place as we do in the first or second. But what Oldenburg was talking about was the sense that these places are disproportionately important in terms of the value in deep and rich senses which they bring, the way in which they make communities into places that are worth living in, the way in which they make life together meaningful. And what happens if you come up with a really simple, kind of helpful idea like that for talking about something which, when you explain it to people, tends to make a lot of sense to them, is that sometimes that idea sort of runs away and has this life of its own and gets taken over by all kinds of people. And in the case of the third place, amongst other people, it got taken over by Starbucks. In the 90s, Starbucks actually tried to kind of take this idea of the third place and sort of build their brand around the idea that what they were doing was providing the third place, providing these spaces that were neither home nor work, where you could hang out, where you could have conversations with people, where you could spend time being sociable. But before we get too pessimistic about the way that big corporations are always taking things over, I think it's important to remember that it never quite works, because they can never quite get it right. It's always kind of fake. And yeah, I was, once upon a time I was a spy. A corporate spy for Starbucks. This is when I was a young, struggling freelance journalist. And
mystery guest.
The mystery shopper, that's right. And so, amongst the different things I did to pay the bills, I would go to the 2 local Starbucks in Sheffield once a month and sort of go through this process of sort of asking particular questions. I had a stopwatch in my pocket, which I had to stop and start so that I was measuring the time they took to serve me. I had to say whether they had fulfilled the script which their Starbucks baristas were supposed to be going through when they spoke to me. But not only that, I had to observe whether during the 20 minutes which I spent in store, I had observed the baristas spontaneously initiating conversation and acknowledging people over and above following the script. And around the same time, I also was living around the corner from this little cafe number 9, which was run by these 2 grumpy old hippies. They did great coffee, and if you went in there and you'd never been in before, they were surly as hell. But yeah, if you kept coming back, then they might start to acknowledge you, and you'd start to notice that actually, they had the regulars who they were really friendly with, and some of the regulars were regular enough that they got to sit at the back table with the owners and smoke dope and do the crossword together. And I started to think, actually, this is the thing which Starbucks can't clone and can't copy. Customer unfriendliness. Because given that we live in a society where we use money, and given that there are all kinds of issues with what being in a highly monetised society does to us, nonetheless, I kind of think it's more okay that I can use money to buy a good cup of coffee than that I can use money to get someone to act like they're my friend. And the thing that Starbucks can't fake, can't get right about a real local, cool, friendly, unfriendly coffee shop is that relationships have to be built up by things other than money. And you can't just hire people who are here today, gone tomorrow, give them a script and tell them that they must spontaneously initiate conversation over and above following the script and replicate that. So the third place, just because Starbucks kind of came along and took it, doesn't mean they got to keep it. We're constantly stealing these things back that the corporations try and steal from us. It's not a one-way street. But I started to wonder whether there was a different issue with the third place, which is that what it was actually describing was a peculiar thing about modern industrial societies, capitalist societies, the kinds of societies that we've inherited and the ways of organising our lives which went with that. Because I started to think that this third place that you spent a few hours a week in, this sociable space, was actually a bit like a native reservation. Kind of in North America, as the continent was conquered and the cowboys fought the Indians and eventually won, the Native Americans end up on these pockets of land, these native reservations on the least desirable corners of land which has been taken over and brought into the new colonial economy. And I kind of feel like sociability has been pushed back, like our indigenous sociability has been pushed back and enclosed to these little pockets of the pub and the coffee shop, because industrial workplaces became antisocial in a new way, because you weren't allowed to do anything in a way which was enjoyable if it made it less efficient and productive. And even homes in the industrial era become more private, more closed off, less sociable spaces. And so this natural sociability, which is actually our default human condition, we are very sociable creatures. It's in our animal selves, it's in our bodies, it's in the ways of being with each other which come naturally to us, which you see when you see children playing together with no adults around, the way in which that sociability just wells up from somewhere at the root of us. That these societies, because of the prioritization of productivity and efficiency and profit, had pushed back sociability into these little pockets which you were allowed to go to for a few hours a week. So rather than just seeing the third place as this good thing which animates our communities, also seeing it as a sign of how damaged and damaging the societies that we've inherited are. And at the same time, again, not seeing this as a one-way negative story, because if we are all born sociable, most of us anyway, then if Vinay Gupta was here, he would tell you that he's an autistic sociopath. I'm just being inclusive. If we're all born sociable, then we can't help being sociable, and we're constantly doing it in our workplaces, in our schools, in our homes. We're constantly pushing back against this enclosure of sociability and stopping for 5 minutes to talk to somebody when we're meant to be working, and coming up with new ideas. Like some of my friends up in Sheffield do this gig in my front room thing. So they started to have one of their friends who's a musician will come around and play, and they'll have 20 people round and they'll put it on Facebook, and people who want to see. So rather than going to a gig in a pub and everyone spending money, you just use your home as a sociable space. And I see all of this stuff is in flux again, and as it's in flux, as industrial societies become more unstable, as these ways of organising our lives, these economies begin to break down, that welling up of sociability keeps breaking through again. So that's the third place. And then we've got Web 2. And Web 2 is really a marketing term which came about a few years ago to try and brand and give a name to a direction which the internet was taking. Even given that it is a marketing term, it's still kind of a useful shorthand in some ways for talking about the point at which the web stopped just being a kind of a free instant postal service and a means of doing online shopping, and started to also be more of a place of collaboration and a place where people were sharing things that they were writing, where people were building things together, like Wikipedia. So this, it's obvious, it's part of the background now. We have to pinch ourselves to remember quite how recent YouTube is, because it's just so much part of our lives and the way that we do things now. But all of this stuff, this collaborative culture of the direction which the internet has taken in the last 5, 6, 7 years, which in some ways is a return to some of the origins of the internet before it was taken over by the sort of dot-coms and commercial web of the late 90s anyway, has at least potentially a sociable characteristic to it. It has a tendency for people to be coming together and meeting each other, and it has a playfulness around it. So that's Web 2. And the third bit, First Life, is a thing where 3 + 2 = 1 or something. Where some of the things which might be problematic about, or worth questioning about technology, can begin to intersect with some of the things that I'm talking about in terms of our sociability and creating sociable spaces to live and work and play and hang out and meet each other in. Because the other thing about the story of the web in the late 90s, when it started to become this global phenomenon, is that it was very much told as a story of the virtualization of more and more areas of our lives. Things we used to do face-to-face, we now do online. So instead of having to find your umbrella and go down to the shops in the rain and go to the bank, you can do all of your banking and all of your shopping online. And it's, this was the story that as this technology became more and more important in our lives, we were going to spend more and more of our time in front of screens. And I don't know about anybody else, but to me that sounds like a nightmare. And the point at which that began to become ridiculous to me was the point where Second Life became this massively hyped thing, and everyone was talking about it as the future of the web, and you had universities paying people huge amounts of money to create a campus in Second Life. And most of us have got one life already. Now, if someone can give me an extra 24 hours in the day, that I would be interested in. I might get some sleep. But this idea that the web was going to keep pushing in this direction, where we virtualized more and more things, we did more and more things through a screen instead of meeting people face to face, just didn't feel right or ring true to me. It wasn't even that I thought it was this bad, evil thing that was happening. It was that I thought it was this myth that was being spun by people who were trying to make money out of it, which was never actually going to happen, because most people wouldn't want it. And I think that, looking back 5 years to when Second Life was being hyped, I think that's true. Where is Second Life now? How many people here have spent any time in the last month in Second Life? How many people?
I had one.
Yes. Well, but the difference with Facebook is you use Facebook to arrange to meet people in the real world, and that's why Facebook has taken off and Second Life hasn't. In a sense, Second Life is a bit like video calling on mobile phones. The mobile industry, when 3G came along, thought that video calling was going to be this great thing. People were going to want to walk down the street talking to someone and seeing each other on their phones. How many people have made a video call from their mobile phone in the last month? 2. 3. How many people have sent a text message from their mobile phone in the last month? The mobile industry had no idea that text messaging was going to be anything. It was just a system that was created for engineers within a company to talk to each other, and then they stuck it on their phones and thought nothing of it. And then it took off, and it became pretty much the biggest thing in the history of mobile phones. Because actually, people don't want immersive technologies which draw you away from where you are more and more into a device. People want people want less information, not more. We've all got too much information. But people want little bits of information that weave in and out of the lives that we have already, our first lives. And I think that that's where all of the things that have excited me in the web in the last few years have come from. They're things like Meetup that make it really, really easy to organise something that you might have needed an institutional structure for before. They're things like Twitter that just kind of weave in and out of your lives and make it more likely that you might meet somebody face to face who you wouldn't have known about before, but who's interested in the same things as you. And I can look around this room and see people here who I met because I was talking about things on Twitter that they were interested in, and we ended up meeting face to face. And so I think at that point where we use these tools to organise things in our first lives, they begin to become tools which help us push out from these enclaves, these kind of pockets of sociability of the third place, and make more and more areas of our lives sociable. And they make it easy and cheap and light and fluid and flexible to organise spaces like this and events like this. I mean, 2 nights ago I wrote a blog post about the Really Free School and about Contemporary School of Thought 2 years ago, which is where I first met some of the people who are involved in making this space. And after I put it up, I thought, right, I'm just going to email a bunch of people who I've met one way or another over the last 5 years, who I would really love to hear come down and talk about something or start a conversation or a discussion. And within 12 hours, I had a dozen really wonderful, interesting people who hadn't known about the free school before, were delighted to have heard about it, and are going to come down and do talks or workshops or discussions over the next 10 days. And I'm far more excited about coming down to hear them talk than I was about talk myself. But I think that one of the effects of these tools is that there's something really, really exciting going on at the moment in London and in Britain, and probably in other countries that I don't know as well. But certainly in this country, there is what, for want of a better word, I wrote a piece today, it's a public thinking scene. It's a scene in the same sense that 50 years ago when Bob Dylan arrived in London as an unknown singer who was struggling to do his second album, and found that every night of the week he could go to a different folk club and learn these traditional English songs that people were rediscovering, and sit there in the basement of a coffee shop in Earl's Court with Martin Carthy. And he went back to New York and recorded his second album with this new sound and this new vision, and all of that stuff through so many different people spawned so much of what we think of when we think of the 1960s. 50 years on, a young person could step off a plane from anywhere in the world today in London and find themselves every night of the week in a different place, at a free event, a meetup, a geek up, a free school, a hack space, having conversations about ideas, about disaster relief shelters, about infrastructure mapping, about educational theory, about bioinformatics, with people they've never met before, who they are able to stumble across through Twitter and through Meetup and through Facebook and through word of mouth and through couch surfing and all of these first life tools which have become the structure of the internet that doesn't try and take over our lives, but just becomes a supporting fabric for organising things a bit differently. And I think that we're in the middle of something extraordinary right now, and something which, despite all of the chaos and despite the awful government that we've got, despite the reality that even if we didn't have such an awful government, no hope lies in the government anyway. Our economic system is on its last legs. We are poorer than our parents in lots of real ways, and if that's only a kind of ambiguous thing now, it will feel like a really acute thing in 5 or 10 years' time, unless I'm very wrong. Despite all of that, one of the things that is making me incredibly hopeful about the moment we're in, and about all of the ideas and connections that are coming together through the protests and the movement that's going on at the moment, is this grassroots web of conversation and ideas and energy and excitement, which you guys are all part of, but which lots of people who we've never met and will never meet are also part of. And that's really the thought that I want to kind of end with, and then we can talk to each other instead of me talking at you, is we're in the middle of something today which is as exciting as anything that was going on in the 60s, and not just for the reasons that people will tell you about Paris in 68, but for all of the other reasons that people are enthused about the 60s. And it's got a realism to it as well. We're not just trying to create utopia or believing in progress. We are making things work. We're using these tools. The internet isn't here to make us rich, like all the headlines in the papers told us. The internet is here to help us do a better job of getting poorer and rediscovering our sociability and making the places where we live and work and play and hang out and spend our time sociable again. So, that's pretty much all I've got to say, but I'm sure it's not all that you've got to say. So does anyone got a question or a thought or would like to take us off in a different direction, tell me I'm wrong.
I want to kind of question the way that you said that we're naturally sociable and that it's just part of our animal nature or something, because this kind of reminds me of you know, the way that we've been told that sexuality is part of our natural animal nature or whatever, and actually there's all kinds of, you know, political forces tied up in it. I wonder whether our society isn't actually repressing sociability through like whether it's actually trying to, you know, desperately manufacture it through things like Facebook, and actually our sociability is now a huge profit center for, you know, a lot of companies.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm a naturally sociable person, but I certainly feel the pressure to be one in the society I live in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there is an artificial sociability, kind of in the same way that Starbucks wants its staff to pretend to be your friend. Facebook wants you to pretend to be everybody's friend. And I think that, you know, some days it's enough to make any of us antisocial. And I think there is...
Is that slightly different? Because that's kind of a popularity thing as opposed to the sociability thing, isn't it? Because
yeah.
Facebook, through having friends, is more the kind of image of being popular by having a lot of friends. So I think it's got that other spin on it of popularity rather than just as, you know, being social.
And I think that you know, real sociability has room for the fact that I'm not feeling very good today. Real sociability is not about have a nice day. It's about me being able to say, do you know what, guys? I'm feeling really shit today. This happened to me. And there being somebody around me who's got time to sit down and have a conversation with me about it, because we're not all being worked stupid by the economic system that we're living under. There's a bit in Female Unit where Germaine Greer talks about the time that she spent in the early 60s in southern Italy with these very poor peasant families and these, you know, large households. And she says the thing that blew her away was the realisation of how antisocial and toxic the nuclear family that she had grown up in and that was normal in our society was. Because in these huge, overcrowded, impoverished families, there was nonetheless a kind of communality which was based on the fact that there was always somebody who had the time to go for a walk with you or to be a shoulder to cry on. Based on the fact that at the end of the day people would all sit around in one room talking about what had happened that day, telling stories or whatever, and when the children fell asleep they would be bundled up into the loft to sleep, rather than the nuclear family of the 50s and 60s where dad comes home from work and mum puts the kids off to sleep so that she gets the kind of bit of time of being a couple that is one of the sociable allowances within the antisocial world, but which is also what puts so much strain on our relationships when we try to get all our intimacy from one person and one relationship. And that's not an argument for polyamory necessarily, it's just an argument for not confusing intimacy and sexuality, and being, you know, a more sociable society would be a society in which we were able to be intimate with each other in all kinds of, you know, ways which are about sharing what's going on for us, rather than feeling like we're locked in this narrow version of ourselves and we're looking for that one person we're going to spend the rest of our lives with whom we're allowed to admit that we're still scared, that there are things that were done to us when we were children, that there are things that, you know, just blow our minds and are inspiring that everyone might think is silly. So a sociable society to me is a society which has room for different kinds of intimacy.
I've always thought that a more group. I didn't like the nuclear family either. I was like sent to Coventry by my entire family for 18 years basically, and there's sort of really nasty types of things going on. But I noticed in the 60s, a lot of people were trying to get out of places like this, shared flats, and they were trying to get away into a little flat of their own, you know, partners, and then have a family alone in making a nuclear family. But I've noticed just recently, in the last year, people are beginning to move out into public spaces. For example, Shepherd's Bush Library is now being used as a co-working space. I know you hate Starbucks, but I used to be the only laptopper about 4 years ago that actually dared to laptop in Starbucks. But in the last 4 months, I can't get a place. I can't get a place. If you go to the Starbucks opposite Centre Point, the top floor of that is just full of people in the third space.
And I think
they've taken it from Starbucks and they're having little parties and things.
yeah, no, I mean, go and steal Starbucks back from them and use it for your things.
That's exactly what's happening.
But also, you know, what part of what's going on there, I suspect, is it's one of the effects of what's going on in the economy. It's people huddling for warmth. Most of my friends are into their 30s and still living in rented house shares where if they had been doing the same kinds of things with their lives a generation ago, they would own a house, or you have a mortgage by now. And we can't deny that there are economic pressures driving that, but we don't have to pretend that we can't see that as an opportunity for learning to be more sociable as well.
So for someone like me, I would compare like the innovation of the internet and HTML to the arrival of the printing press in Europe. And a lot of people might disagree with that in terms of a paradigm shift. So you go from incredible information scarcity before the printing press to relative information scarcity / abundance with the printing press, mass literacy, and now you're arguably in a position where you have like information abundance. I mean, absolutely everything is accessible all the time. If you want to find out about it. Now the sort of society you have before and after the printing press is radically different. You have feudalism, serfdom, you have Catholicism, myth, king, country, God. Subsequent to that you have public spheres, schools, universities, industrialism, nation state. For somebody like you, I mean, so that's a huge change. It takes a long time, of course. But with the arrival of the internet, the arrival of networks, the arrival of this kind of 2.0 existence that facilitates the first life stuff, how dramatically different could life be within our lifetimes, in your opinion? I mean, I'm not going to get you to speculate what exactly will happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you think it's? I mean, the possibility for radical emancipatory change. Do you think it's genuinely there?
I'm pretty sure that life is going to be extraordinarily different within our lifetimes. History's happening really fast right now. And that's not just because of technology, but technology is one of the things in the mix. My great hero and inspiration, John Berger, once wrote, "Never again will a single story be told as if it were the only one." And the story which you told really clearly and nicely there is one of the stories we can tell about the last 800 years or so. The story of the move from feudalism to the beginnings of modern society and the public sphere and industrialism, and the story of the printing press as this pivotal thing, and maybe the internet as the next such pivot. And I'm not saying that that story is wrong or untrue. I'm just saying it's only one of the stories we can tell, because we can also tell the story which draws attention to the fact that the average peasant in the Middle Ages in Europe worked far fewer days of the year than the average person does today. They also have far fewer days in their life. So it's not, I don't want to romanticize, I just want to say, like, there is a plurality of ways in which people have lived in different times and places, and as things change, it's not necessarily, we don't necessarily have to always be telling the story of change and of emancipation as a story of the escape from the dreadfulness of the past into the possibility of the future. Sometimes we can also tell it as the story of the moments in which we can reconnect to something that was good in the past that got lost along the way, and that in the process of getting lost we got something else that was good maybe, but we paid a heavy price for that. So for example, one of the stories I often tell is to say that the deal of the Industrial Revolution was that we got material abundance in terms of unprecedented material standards of living in many ways, at the cost of becoming dependent on money to meet our staying alive needs to an unprecedented extent. Most societies which have ever existed have had something a bit like money, but only in modern industrial societies has money been as essential to as many aspects of our lives, including our basic ability to feed and shelter ourselves as it is now. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, I'm just saying it's a complex thing, and who knows what's coming next.
Well, it's very interesting what you said about how Bob Dylan sort of came to London and went back to America with new ideas to make music. And maybe you're going to do something similar at the moment. Bob Dylan had the record industry, which is amazing to believe, as an outlet. What about us in our short-term, immediate future? Where are the new ways to run companies or universities that we can sort of plug in now that is more inspired by this Web 2.0 first life approach?
I think we're all making it up as we go along. We're living in a moment where most of the things which are meant to work don't work. So 2 years ago, around the time of the temporary school, I got invited by mistake to have breakfast with David Miliband when he was Foreign Secretary, because I was involved with this web startup called School of Everything, which some of you might have heard about. I did a talk about that at the temporary school, and it was based on some really radical ideas about education, and it became sort of a tech company, but hopefully doing some interesting, useful things. And anyway, they were doing this thing where they get together half a dozen people from an industry to have a meeting with senior people from the Foreign Office and UK Trade and Investment, all about how the government can support our companies going out and making money abroad. And by mistake, they had invited me. And at the beginning of this meeting, Miliband said, right, well, you're here because UKTI wants to help your industry, because your industry is going to help us make it through this recession. And so I'd like to spend the first half of the meeting talking about how we can help you. But I'd like to spend the second half of the meeting talking about how you can help us. Because we know that the levers of power that we use in foreign policy aren't working. And we think there might be some things which you guys have figured out with the web, which might work. And as a good anarcho-pragmatist, I really didn't think that I had many illusions left about governments and about the people who run the world. But I discovered in that moment that some little part of me still thought there were grown-ups up there somewhere. And, you know, they're pretending that the world works. And they'll keep pretending for a little bit longer, and things will keep breaking down more and more obviously. And in different areas of life, they will keep pretending to the last possible moment. So you won't have any kind of smooth, gentle transition, townsy transition. What you'll have is, you know, Roadrunner spinning in the air, and then plonk. And, you know, it will happen. Maybe this year, maybe next year, to the higher education system in this country. You know, the head of department of an art college said to me a few weeks ago, all it would take is for the Chinese economy to dip and British higher education would collapse. That's how dependent our university system is on foreign students from just one country. That's how precarious things are. And you look again and again in different areas of the way that the world works, and you see all of these precariousnesses, all of these rickety, ramshackle things. And when things break, whatever is there can come in and fill that space. And so I think the things that are going on in this scene that I'm talking about, that we're part of here, but that also connects to all kinds of other things that might not immediately seem the same, but have a similar character of learning and sharing and getting together because we actually like being here, rather than as a means to an end to get a good job or whatever. I think a lot of that stuff is stuff which will still work. When the stuff which doesn't really work, but which we're pretending works, breaks down more obviously, and they have to go, shit, what can we put here? But how, when that will happen, I don't know. But vigilance and you know, spotting the opportunities to go, hey, let us just do something with this space that would otherwise be sitting empty. Yeah. Sometimes you ask permission, sometimes you ask permission retrospectively, but it's kind of all, it's all part of, you know, filling in, making it up as we go along, improvising a future which is more sociable and which works.
But that's not happening at the moment anywhere near that scale. Like, it's still such a scene. It's still such a tiny scene. Like, when you look at what's happening in the student movement or in the movement, anti-cuts movement, more widely, the demands and the rhetoric that are being made are for a return to a educational system or a tax system that they're not there because capital can't sustain them and has no interest in sustaining them, even if they could.
There's a lot of social democratic nostalgia around.
Yeah, so people are arguing for a return to sort of universal free education, which cannot exist. So how do we then create spread those ideas out so that the rhetoric of the student movement isn't what it is in a moment, which is reactionary?
Why can't it not exist if it existed 30 years ago? Isn't that kind of existence proof?
No, because capital's changed. We're now moving to capital rather than a lot fewer people going to university.
There's a long conversation to be had here, which I think will probably come up in other discussions and sessions, and I'm inclined to agree with you, but it would take me a long time to explain why, and I wouldn't convince everyone to agree with me. But what I would say, so I'm not yet. Unlike George Monbiot, I don't actually like having arguments with people. So that's
for those. I'm not sure it's nostalgia though. I think there is also that there are quite a lot of Trojan horses arguments being put forward, and quite a lot of people who are actually pushing for free education without it necessarily being the university education that has been known up to now. That I think that there's also the possibility, because I think that actually, the argument that is being pushed to say we cannot have free education is that supposedly there is no money anymore.
Yeah.
Well, that is not true. There is money. There's plenty of it. It's that we just need to
let's
go
find
back
new
to this,
ways of
redistributing it. Redistribution of wealth is this really old-fashioned notion that maybe would be worth revisiting. But I think that sometimes it can be important to use arguments that are quite grabbing to be able to start conversations. And I think that, for instance, the UK Uncut strategy of using the pay or taxes is actually really clever, because I agree it seems like a really, really liberal, depressing demand, and yet what it does when you do the actions, when you actually sit at the door of Vodafone's and start talking to people, is that it's an amazing start for a conversation that actually says, well, really, isn't there any money? Well, what about that money? And if that money is available, then what can we do about it? And maybe that means that, yes, as you thought, the government is lying to you. So I think that sometimes it's important to not just stop at the surface of these arguments, and that these Trojan horses strategies can be really efficient. It's just a matter of not stopping there and actually have the strategy behind.
And it's also, you're absolutely right. What's brilliant about UK Uncut is it's so hard to disagree with, and arguments which have that quality of common sense are incredibly powerful. And it makes visible the world works. Even if you can't make Vodafone pay their taxes, if we make visible how fucked up this is, that changes people's perception. It changes the space we're in.
I was just going to say that this is like a very multicultural room, and we have to remember that 70% of the planet is used by 30% of the population, but the other 70% that only has 30%, they have an extended family, they have a sense of community or communality, right? And they do have a good life from their standard, from their point of view, and they're much more happy and fight for their rights. What we had was, even when television came out, they always warned you, don't let your children get sucked into the box, and they have to be 6 foot away from it because of the rays. Right? Now they've created all these new toys that are so easy to just jump into, but it doesn't make you have more contact. I mean, you can keep in touch with your friends, but it's information anarchy, where you can find out more things of what's happening around the world, but then it's also information overload, because you get so much information, what do you do with it? So Even from the 20th century, we're not getting more direct action. People aren't standing up for their rights. But we can look into the future and see beyond the constructed reality of the establishment.
Yeah.
So the next thing that's coming is the United States of Europe. So if students want to go forward into the 21st century, if the student unions of this country have a connection, which they do, but a stronger connection with all the other universities, like they've privatized secondary school in Italy and universities, the French, the Greeks, everybody else, especially southern countries who will take to the streets and fight for their rights. If all of the students in Europe had one unity, and if there's one strike against one of them, then all of Europe's students came out, then you could convince the European Union before they signed the Constitution that there's free education in Europe.
Maybe.
Why bother?
You'll have graduated by then.
Look.
I have graduated, but why
Okay.
bother when there's like spaces like this and like the discussion is like opening up? And
Well, we don't have to agree. This is the great thing. Like, we should all be pursuing all of the different strategies that we feel we should be pursuing, and not. The point of coming together in rooms like this is to have a conversation, not to arrive at a party line.
Yes.
Lloyd.
So one of the things that disturbs me is the idea that students being active and organised means that they need to be fighting something. I was interested in your, yes, there's lots of things to fight, but there's also lots of things to find mutual, and I'm interested in what you were saying about intimacy. And really, what aspects of intimacy are you seeing emerging in these spaces? Because you talked about the confusion of intimacy and sexuality, and me being intimate with you means I'm going to put my hand in your shirt. If you're lucky. But what else is there? What else is there? Unpick that.
I think there's something intimate about being here now. Like, because we don't have the defence of irony or alienation. None of us can claim that we're here because we had to be here. And that's vulnerable because that means we're actually manifesting our desire by being here. And that's like, that, intimacy doesn't have to be like foreground intensity. It can be a background texture that makes something feel special. Whenever I walk into a space like this, I feel like I've just come out of the desert into an oasis. Because we live in a desert, a social desert, in which people walk down the street trying to avoid eye contact, in which people go to work, and part of the kind of unacknowledged contract in so many cases, in so many places and times between people at work is, obviously none of us want to be here, we're just here because we have to pay the rent. And then so many people are in relationships where they're only really in the relationship because they don't want to think too hard about like the crisis and chaos it would bring to their lives if they dismantled the economic partnership which is represented by this marriage which has gone cold on them, or whatever. And intimacy, again, like sociability, just wells up from within us. It's what happens when we forget to stop it happening. It's something, there's something magical and powerful about it.
My question is, as always, what happens when you go beyond the sea? As in, that's in two senses, in the sense of, how do you translate that to the wider world? Because we know what things can work. We know that people meet each other on a kind of no promises, no strings basis. Interesting things happen. We know that we can actually solve a lot of social problems that way. But how does that go, A, beyond Web 2.0, as in upwards, as into those who actually have the purse strings and things? And then also, how do you reach those who aren't online? Because my hunch, the more I work on this, is that the more information there is, the more open source we get, the more everything becomes magnified. Actually, the more we're entrenching inequality. and the more we're entrenching the kind of social norms where you have to know the password to be in the club. And I think you don't want to be the person in the room kind of going, oh, where's everyone else? Like, I'm not saying that, but more information doesn't mean more knowledge.
Yeah.
And
more knowledge doesn't mean more wisdom.
Fair. And, you know, like, people get lost in Second Life. As in, the people that you work with and that I work with are really down with First Life. That's everything that we're doing is about that. But you have new forms of social illness, as it were, that come up through getting lost in Second Life. So, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
None of us are the government, except of our own selves. And some of those questions are questions which only apply if you think that the world has to be solved by governments. Even the language of inequality, we actually have to be careful with, because it's a language that disempowers, it's a language which reduces, it's a language which makes things about statistics. That does not mean that we should ignore the cruelties of how life is for many people. It does not mean we should take for granted any of the particular kinds of abundance which we have. But at one level, we all have to work it out ourselves, but not ourselves alone, ourselves together. And the think tanks and the policy makers and the government departments are not going to have a lot to do with how we make things work. They never have. Well, I don't know, we could get into that argument. There are definitely things which government has been useful for, big infrastructure things, and there are ways in which redistribution has been important and worked, and there are fights to be had around that. But I still believe that the heart of what matters and what makes life meaningful and worth living is something which it's very hard for those kinds of power structures to take responsibility for. In terms of how things scale, though, but I don't want us to say we won't touch them, we won't talk to them. I want some of us, and everyone should, you know, we need to try different things. For me, and for some of the people who I hang out with and work with, I want us to try being pirates. I want us to go and grab bits of money where we can, but use it to do the things we know are worth trying, and not to know that highly monetized ways of living do us damage, but to also be prepared sometimes to try grabbing some money and using it to try something big. I don't know which way things will grow or spread, but I think it's important to avoid defining people in terms of their need, their lack, their deficit, their deprivation, because when we talk in that way, we always end up further disempowering people. So the projects that I do with Space Makers, which is one of the organisations that I started, we start by going into an area and, as much as I do about this, we start with the attitude that there is already an abundance of knowledge and of ideas and of energy and of resources and of people and of possibilities in an area. There is not a real shortage, but the ways in which government and local authorities and lots of traditional ways of intervening will look at that area as they will define it in terms of the percentage of people in poverty, the percentage of people who don't have access to the internet. Not everyone has to have access to the internet, but we could have a place like Access Space in Sheffield in a garage on every street. And I think that's more likely to happen through people like us getting together in spaces like this than through the government getting its act together. But maybe that's just
people like us.
Sorry?
Do people like us infiltrating think tanks?
Yeah, people like us infiltrating things like government. Yeah, no. Good luck.
To get back to the sort of awkward issue of money, I was wondering what you might have to say about the issue of the ownership of internet service providers, because obviously you were saying before that the internet as a platform to make money is problematic. It's more likely to be useful for people like us. But the sort of like the basic issue of ISPs that are running a profit seems too big to ignore.
Yeah, no, the internet was built by the military and is run by capitalists, and yet I'm claiming that it has some kind of radical and revolutionary potential. And I have a lot of faith in the hackers. Most of the people with the technical skills and knowledge inside those companies and organisations are ethically closer in spirit to a place like this than to the shareholders of those companies, and they're the people with the real skills and the tools. I have a lot of faith in redundancy, like not in the sense of losing a job, although I committed career suicide in 2003 and I haven't looked back, so I can recommend it personally. But redundancy in the sense of there is more than we could possibly use of bits of technology lying around which we can cobble together. If the internet was dismantled, I think the hackers would reassemble some cobbled together version of it. And if you go and visit the London hack space, you'll meet the people who will convince you of that.
In Barcelona they have a network called GUIFI.net, GUIFI.net. They have, I think, 11,000 nodes of, it's just it's a network of the commons. Just people, you grab a router and you connect to the closest point and you're just part of the net. It's connected through to the internet, but it works totally separated.
And if it,
and there are people trying to do this.
Yeah,
that's where
like Pirate Bay, probably the people to look to, because they've just started a project where they're trying to do peer-to-peer DNS system, which is like the naming records of where all the websites are, which is like an almost impossible task. But they built the Pirate Bay, and they're also building other projects like the pay system, where you can go, where basically you put $20 into an account each month, and then every website you visit, people have buttons, you click it, and then at the end of each month, at the end of each month, like the percentage is divvied up between the content that you liked, and if everybody used that, then everybody would get paid for the projects that they believe in, they're working on. So if anybody wants to sign up for that, that has money.
And my friend Smari McCarthy from Iceland has been a few times over to Afghanistan to the Fab Lab in Jalalabad. Now, after the invasion of Afghanistan, the US military and the occupation forces had this multi-billion-dollar plan for the internet for Afghanistan, which, as far as I know, absolutely none of it has yet happened. The Fab Lab, on a few tens of thousands of dollars, set up a thing where they were creating a mesh network for the city of Jalalabad.
Running on 12 volt batteries.
There you go.
No net mains, no nothing, completely independent. Wireless, no wires, no nothing.
So this is, and you know, if the worst comes to the worst, we will be couriering information around the world, or at least around the bits of the world which are walkable between.
IP over avian carriers.
Yeah, or old mobile phone memory cards in bags in our pockets, walking from place to place, and we will have a human-powered internet. But this stuff, it's going to be really, really hard for this stuff ever to go away.
There's also buythissatellite.org, which is one of my favourite ideas for this independent internet. There's this guy, and I wrote a blog post about this last weekend about how to create a pirate internet. But anyway, his whole thing is that he wants to get this satellite from this bankrupt telecom company and move it over Africa to provide free satellite internet to the entire continent. I think that's such a wonderful idea.
It's a wonderful idea. It's easy to shut down.
One satellite, one missile.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. We have an abundance. We have a surplus of ideas. And if any of you are ever in Sheffield, go and visit my friends at Access Space. It's about 2 minutes walk from the main railway station in the centre of Sheffield. And they were the guys who woke me up to all of this stuff. They started this thing in the late 90s called the Redundant Technology Initiative, because they were artists who were making net art in the early days of that, and they objected to the idea that you had to be able to afford £1,000 worth of equipment before you could start making net art. So they wrote a manifesto where they said, we will only make art with technology we can get for free. And they thought this was going to be a challenge, and within a year they ended up with a warehouse full of computers that people were giving them, and they discovered that the challenge was not getting their hands on stuff, it was that the group of them didn't have enough ideas to use all of this stuff they were being given. So they opened the UK's first walk-in internet learning centre where anyone can come in and learn how to use the internet to make things rather than just to be a consumer. And it's still going, and it's now the longest running internet learning centre in the UK, and they've watched so many government-funded digital inclusion projects open up and shut down because they were run stupidly, while they're running this stuff on machines they got for free, on free open source software, and with a peer learning model, and doing it on a shoestring of arts funding. And in Brazil, there are people who kind of have been cooperating with Access Space who are doing the same thing on a much larger scale with networks of hundreds of spaces like this. So there's an abundance of possibility.
The Brazilians also hijacked the satellite
Did that?
for networking.
Cool.
The American Navy or Army's communication system. I don't know how much data they run on it, but they were using mobile phone calls.
Right.
And stuff like that. So they were using the satellite network. It worked for quite a while. It's quite easy to do that if you know a little bit about electronics.
See, the geek will inherit the earth.
You already have.
Don't you think you're in danger of defining real sociability from your own experiences, like to do with intimacy and communication stuff? Really, sociability comes from survival, from the tribe and sharing skills to survive, and that maybe we're much closer to sort of having to think like that than we think we are. The price of oil goes to $300 and war in the Middle East. It's not hard to think to imagine.
No, I mean, if anyone's read the Dark Mountain Manifesto, which I half wrote, then I've got some fairly bleak ideas about how those things may well play out in the next few years. But yeah, whatever I'm saying is coming from my perspective, because I'm just me sat here and.
You should say there's an abundance. I have a question.
Well, so okay, we can talk about scarcity and abundance briefly. Scarcity is always made up of a mixture of the material and the social and cultural. The economic ideology under which we live likes to direct our attention always towards the material and away from the social and cultural, because if we realised that lots of the scarcity we experience is a result of social, cultural, economic and political constructs rather than as a result of a fundamental material not having enough stuff, we might get radicalised. And so what I'm really trying to say, I mean, Vinay Gupta, if he was here, would be saying 85% of the stuff we produce is rubbish that we could happily live without. And whether or not he's precisely right on the 85%, as an order of magnitude, that feels plausible to me. And so when I talk about abundance and redundancy, part of what I'm talking about is the gap. Sustainability went wrong for so many reasons as a language. One of the reasons it went wrong was because it came to mean sustaining our current way of living, as if that were possible. But also that's a really, really hard challenge. I'm much more interested because it's not as hard and it's much more imaginative in the question of how we go on having livable human existence, how life continues to be meaningful. And I think that it's entirely real and possible for life to get more meaningful as we get poorer. And I think we are going to get poorer, so we might as well figure out how we can get more meaningful, more sociable lives, how we can defend ourselves from that poverty being forced down onto those at the bottom, and at the same time, how we can not be in denial about the fact that our way of living has been made possible by things that cannot be sustained, whether that's oil or whether that's the domination of most of the planet by a relatively small part of the planet's population. Shall we stop there?